Hi, everyone. Doc T here with another episode of the Horse Advocate podcast. I apologize again for the lack of video and audio quality because I am again in a hotel room in my second week of being on the road taking care of horses' teeth. This is going to be another short one. And the reason it's going to be short is because I'm going to bring to you another idea that is going to be a little bit complex. And because it's complex and actually new, then it takes time to assimilate. And I'm just so excited to tell you about lactate and gluconeogenesis using lactate, because it has a factor in how we deal with our horses. And it just, when I come across these new things, it shakes me up. In fact, I can't even sleep. I have to dig in and research it a little bit more and try and get more information. And some of these ideas that I get are relatively new, but this idea is approximately 30 years old. But unfortunately, the human community has not embraced it, and they are not embracing it because it goes against what we have been taught for approximately 100 years. So if you are like me, who have taken some sort of biochemistry class, and we've learned how glucose is used in our everyday energy production, we have been taught that glucose enters the cytoplasm of a cell and it becomes, through glycolysis, something called pyruvate. And I know you guys are just trying to tune in and learn about horses. And I know some of the things I say will become complicated, and I risk you tuning out or just clicking off. But please don't. Again, I'm going to try and make this short and to the point because I think it's that important for you and for your horse. Most horse people have been made aware of sugar, and we know that sugar is another word for carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are often infused with starch and maybe with the word glucose. And I introduced to you another type of sugar that we get called fructose. And I don't want you to think about fructose anymore. That's off to the side. That was last episode, and it's very important. But we're now going to look at glucose. So glucose is a molecule that is put together by plants to make something called starch. And you and I and our horses and our dogs and all the other animals on the world love glucose. Glucose is so important and is used in every cell that we know of. But what I just learned is going to turn your world upside down again, because glucose really isn't the fuel that we think it is. Glucose is made up of 6 carbon molecules, and wherever a carbon is attached to another carbon, when that breaks apart, a lot of energy is made. Or where the carbon and hydrogens are, when they break apart, it makes a lot of energy. But what I always thought was glucose was the be-all and end-all, but it's not. It turns out that glucose is divided into 2 smaller molecules, each with 3 carbons. So instead of being C6, it's now C3. So those 2 carbons are almost identical, but they're not. There's a major difference. One of them we call pyruvate, and this is what we've all been taught goes into the Krebs cycle to make all this energy. And it requires oxygen. But then we were all told that when we don't have oxygen, in other words, when our horses are being exercised to the point that they're becoming exhausted, the oxygen is depleted, and then we go into something called lactate. Now, my wife brought this up to me this morning. She says, lactate is, milk, lactose, lactating. No, this is called lactate, and it has nothing to do with milk. Now, and lactate is a 3-carbon molecule that's made by dividing the sugar glucose into 3 carbons. And lactate is, we've been always told that it's produced in low oxygen environment, and it leads to lactic acidosis and tying up or cramping or things like that. Well, it turns out that is all wrong. In fact, it is so opposite. There's no acid creation. The pH does not become more acidic. It actually creates a more basic environment, direct opposite. And more importantly, lactate is used by every cell in the body to create energy. Gosh, it gets even better than that. Lactate can actually go in and out of cells without any transport, doesn't need insulin. Lactate doesn't damage the cells, with one exception, which I'll get to. Lactate actually is drawn into the mitochondria, and it creates a lot of energy. And then it comes back out, and it can go through the cell back into the blood, and it can be carried back to the liver. And in the liver, lactate can become glucose again, 2 lactates, or lactate and pyruvate or something. I don't know exactly how it happens, but it can come out as glucose again. So glucose can go back to the cells and do it all over again. So that just blows my mind, because we've been talking about gluconeogenesis created by amino acids, and that's a very good way of doing it. But there's something called the Cori cycle, C-O-R-I, Cori cycle, named after a husband-wife team who developed it, and that's the cycle where the cell creates lactate, it goes back to liver, and then it comes back as glucose to the cell again. But lactate can also go back into the cell and be reused again. A lactate can actually come out of the cell and go to its next door neighbor and go into that cell. In fact, it turns out that glucose, when taken in, will go right into the cells of the lining of the gut, and immediately most of it's converted into lactate. And lactate is what is transmitted out to the rest of the body to fuel it, to make it operate. So there's something called the oral glucose tolerance test, which I've been saying is the be-all and end-all for testing insulin resistance in horses. And it turns out that that test is registering how much glucose is available in the blood after about 30 minutes or so. But now what we realize is, when you dump the glucose in for this test, the majority of it is converted into pyruvate. And whatever glucose is available as a whole will be stored in the liver. Not all of it, but a portion of it. And then around 30 minutes later, it'll start to release some of that back out. And it turns out that's what we're measuring. But if you also measured the lactate, you would see that in 5 minutes, it's really elevating, and it peaks at 15 minutes. And I mean, that's just earth-shaking for most veterinarians who thought that glucose and the oral glucose tolerance test was the best way to test for insulin resistance. And it is. There's no doubt about it. But what's really happening is we're testing after the fact. And in reality, glucose was probably much higher if the gut wasn't able to break it down. So the gut immediately breaks down sugar into lactate, and that goes out safely into body to fuel everything. By the way, lactate in the brain is so important. It is the number one preferred fuel. So glucose is taken up by cells in the brain, but glucose cannot be taken up by neurons. Neurons are the cells that are the nerves, whereas the astrocytes are the cells that provide functions to the neurons, supplies. And so in the astrocyte, the glucose becomes lactate, and then it's the lactate that goes into the neurons. Ketones are also improved or are helped into the neurons. So ketones and lactate are both great fuels for the brain, and the brain will take lactate over ketones any day. Ketones come from the breakdown of fat, and the hindgut of the horse will make a lot of things called, or a lot of short-chain fatty acids. One is called beta-hydroxybutyrate, and beta-hydroxybutyrate, BHB, is what is butter. And this is why I put butter and ketones into my coffee in the morning. And people think I'm really smart, but I'm just supercharging my brain. And this is one way that I do it. It really helps to clarify a foggy brain. So that's what's going on there. Does that help the horse? Well, absolutely. Because as you decrease the amount of sugar that's coming in, this is really important. You're going to make more lactate available. Now, this doesn't make sense because you thought that it came from glucose, but I'll explain. When glucose comes in an excess amount, the cell is going to be filled with glucose stored as glycogen, and the lactate is going to be filled, and the fat that's inside the cell is going to be maxed out. And the cell is going to start to reject the glucose through insulin resistance. And so the cell is going to live on the lactate that's in there. But the lactate has to come out and go back to the liver. But there's insulin resistance. So any glucose that's made there is going to come to the cell that already has insulin resistance, and it's not going to come in. So you actually have a depletion of glucose availability. So adding more lactate doesn't really help. You have to decrease the amount of glucose coming in so you have an overall decrease around the body of glucose. So my wife and I were kind of discussing this, trying to figure out how you as a horseman are going to make hay out of this. Sorry for the pun. But it simply boils down to this. I'm going to explain it as a river or a stream in your woods. The water comes in from one side and just moves across the stream and goes on. So there's a flow going on, and that flow always brings fresh water. But if it's blocked and that flow doesn't occur anymore, then the water just is held there and becomes stagnant. And this is really important, that our cells have a flow coming into the cell of glucose, of fatty acids, and of lactate. Lactate's got to be coming in and out on its own, and same with everything else. But when you have insulin resistance, you're going to have an accumulation of glucose in the cell that's not going to be used much. And you're also going to resist having fat come in that exceeds capacity. In other words, the cell is going to fill up with fat, but the cell isn't going to use the fat because there's too much glucose around. And of course, lactate's not going to come in and out because there's just too much of it in the cell and outside of the cell. Things become saturated and flow just gets reduced. When that happens, the cell starts to fail. And what's really interesting is lactate, when it's moving, doesn't bother anything. Now, if you recall, I said glucose in another episode. Glucose damages proteins that it touches. This is why it has to be bound to insulin anytime it's out there. But lactate, as long as it's moving, isn't going to cause any problems. But they're now realizing that when lactate starts to accumulate inside a cell and doesn't move, then it becomes destructive. And in fact, most research is leading toward the accumulation of lactose within a cell as to one of the possibilities of cancer formation or carcinogenic properties of stagnant lactate. So what's the best way to get lactate moving? Well, there's two ways. Number one, restrict the amount of sugar that's coming in, restricted to a season. So don't be overfeeding your horses when there's no sugar out there. Give them some months of time off. And the other is to increase exercise. It turns out that when you couple exercise actually creates more lactate. And when you exercise, you also change the pH in the muscle, and that causes the lactate to become a signaling compound that causes the mitochondria to become more dense, which means it can produce more energy out of the single mitochondria. And that makes us feel better. It consumes more of this glucose. And our horses and our cells will feel better with exercise. Now, if your horses are just pasture ornaments or they're lame and they can't run around, there's not much that we can do for that. But we can affect the other side of the equation by looking at the amount of glucose that we're putting into their bodies. So again, it boils down to the simple bottom line that we have to decrease the amount of sugar that we're putting into our horses, and we have to increase exercise. And isn't that what our mothers told us? Isn't that what all the gurus are saying? Decrease sugar and increase exercise. But I wanted to bring to you this idea, this concept, that lactate actually is running around the countryside doing all this. It's in every corner of your body. It turns out to be the most preferred fuel anywhere. And the idea that it causes acidosis in the muscles is now debunked. It doesn't make sense. What's actually happening is depletion of the energy that's there. And that's what causes the horse to, or you to run out of steam. So one last thought before I leave you with this short video or audio if you're on podcasting is when you're in a fight or flight sympathetic mode, sympathetic system is where you are hunting, you're running, you're avoiding, you're doing everything that has stress involved with it. So you're in the fight or flight mode. Your body will produce a lot of lactate. And that's okay as long as it's temporary. But when it continues to produce this lactate, you start to get accumulation inside the cell that's no longer flowing. And that can lead to further destruction of the cells. And we don't want that. We want that energy to flow in and out. So lactate is produced and then it is cleared. It is a flow of energy into the cell and then back out of the cell. And it's a continuous nonstop process from birth to death. And if we don't allow that flow to occur, we're starting to get problems in the cell. So exercise is really important. Oh, and by the way, when you do exercise and you exercise really hard, at least in humans, it will affect the brain to counteract ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone. And you aren't hungry after exercise. A good deal of exercise will stop the urge to eat. And that's the effect of lactate in the brain. I thought that was an interesting sidebar. So if you exercise and you don't feel like eating for a couple hours, that's lactate that you've produced, and that's flowing through your body correctly. And by the way, after exercise, when you're in a period of rest and recuperation, that's when the lactate is consumed. And now that ATP is restored, That's the currency of energy in the cell. And when ATP gets high, lactate production decreases. And that allows fat to come into the cell and be used as energy. So I talked about mitochondrial flexibility, and that's where the mitochondria can switch between using fat or, in this case, lactate for fuel. And it's really important to have that flexibility. So athletes have that. But when you become sedentary, then that flexibility doesn't occur. So the fat never gets consumed, and lactate is the fuel that's constantly being used, especially with the excess sugar that's coming in the mouth. So the body fat just keeps accumulating. And so with age, all of us start to gain weight that we can't get rid of because we're not moving as much. So I guess that does it. Hopefully that's not too much. It's not too overwhelming. I love bringing new ideas to everybody. Now you know about fructose, and now you know about lactate. And these are all carbohydrates, and they're all sugars, and we can't live without them. They are important. This is why there's so many mechanisms within the body to not only maintain glucose availability for the brain, because the brain can't live without glucose. And it turns out it can't live without lactate. Remember, I'm not saying lactose. That's the sugar of milk. I'm talking about lactate, and that's half of a glucose molecule. And it's everywhere, and it's fueling everything. And so we definitely need that, and it recycles and becomes glucose again. So I don't think you and I are ever going to run out of glucose unless we're in a starvation situation. But having some time off and allowing our bodies to switch, our mitochondria to switch, and having our horses have some time off where they're not eating 24/7 is allowing the mitochondria to become flexible and getting them healthier, which is important. So a little bit of fasting, decreasing the amount of sugar that's in the pasture. In other words, if you have pasture out there, don't be feeding hay. And if you're unlucky and don't have any pasture, then you have hay. That's all you've got. But as winter comes, decrease a little bit. Let the horse lose a little body fat. They'll actually become healthier because you're allowing the mitochondria to become flexible. And you'll know that because as the indicators, the horse is losing body fat and becoming thin. And that means the horse is actually becoming healthier, which is exactly what we want. So when the green grass of spring comes, they can go back out and gain body fat again and do that ebb and flow cycle. That's the way it's set up. That's the way it's supposed to be. All right. Thanks for taking your time and spending it with me at the Horses Advocate podcast. I should be home fairly soon. I've got a couple of podcasts coming up with guests that are going to bring some pretty interesting stuff, such as horsemanship used in leadership skills and bit seats. I've got a gal who wants to come on the podcast and talk about the bits and bit fitting, things like that. And if you can think of anything else you want to talk about, I'm all for it. I love just learning all about horses, from the molecular to the big stuff. You know, I'd love to learn about pastures. If I could find a pasture expert who can talk to me about grasses, that would be really good. And maybe I'll throw in some things about horse farms. You know, maybe one or two of you are out there trying to figure out how to close a gate or build a gate or build fences or build a barn. I've certainly seen my fair share, and I'll add those too. So again, thank you for sharing this with other people. Thank you for being here. And this is Doc T. I'll see you later.
Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There are two reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, Go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.